that has been happening. For some people, they view the crisis that has been happening as some form of ethnic mobilization. For some, as an opportunistic criminality. Choosing to turn a blind eye, obviously, to the millions of the poor who've been confined to the margins of society, disenfranchised from society, who are alienated, feel that, feel that they are invisible from the economy, have no stake in it as well. These people, like we've been seeing that they are witnessing, they are looting because of the deep structural inequality and their lived experiences of poverty. The masses, the poor people, the working class, they have realized there's no magic formula or any crisis intervention that will make them escape poverty. Uh, since the start of the pandemic last year, and also like since like we've been confined, jailed into lockdowns, the state has been on some form of anti-poor crusade. And we are seeing this because of like 1.4 million workers have lost their jobs since last year. Unemployment sits at 45%, worst amongst the youth, a 75% rate of unemployment. Almost over 0.5% of the youth is unemployment currently. No hope of any like job being created. As if that is not enough, comrades. A household basket costs 4,000, over 4,000, which is 1,000 more than the minimum wage. Furthermore, we've seen the state cutting back on social welfare programs, including the 350 grand, as well as freezing the public wage increment. And like also like this comes at a time when with every lockdown, the GDP shrinks with 1%. Uh, those those who've managed to keep their jobs, some classify them as the working poor, working but earning below a living wage. And like this is like a live reality within the workers in South Africa, where workers they are working, but like they're earning, their salary doesn't even cover a basic um, basket. Comrades, the status quo has condemned the poor and treats them with contempt. What is happening is an expression of those who are marginalized, showing their discontent from the state that has completely failed them and also failed to transform their material living conditions. For the past 27 years, the working class, the majority of the working poor, which are black, their living materials have not changed, not even from a bar of soap. I don't think, as we are hearing some form of like some growing narrative that we like on the dominant media, that like what is happening is an ethnic mobilization. I don't think like we are near the 90s ethnic mobilization. I don't think we are near there. But I think like we are near within, we should like look at like within the class lines which are embedded within the structural inequality. Uh, this cuts deep. Uh, okay, these deep acts of gratuitous violence, which we see in our neighborhoods, of course, some of you are seeing it in television, are the results of the failed 27 years of democracy, a failed statehood which is far away from the lived experiences of the poor. In this case, the majority being black, and also like the continuation of the state implementation of austerity measure, uh, whether like cutting back on social welfare, education expenditure, public health, etc. However, instead of the state responding with a sure economic approach um, to the current unrest that predates Zuma's arrest, it chose a militaristic approach of deploying soldiers, which cost over 600 million. This is to confine the poor to poverty, repress any form of mobilization against the growing inequality.
It's already past us, so it's already
Today,
ahead.
at the height of capitalism crisis, exacerbated by the pandemic, the working class must educate, organize, and lead itself in the course of the revolutionary struggle. The riots have exposed that capitalism can be disrupted, but it is only temporary. At this moment, the state has begun to unleash its coercive forces against the poor. The door-to-door campaigning we are seeing in Alexandra and other township of KwaZulu-Natal, and the state siding with capitalism on attacking the poor. Comrades, we should also look at from this point, the limitation of the riots have been on looting. However, it has undermined the capitalist establishment in the country. So it also what it has taught us as a lesson for the left is that now more than ever we need a socialist revolution where the working class sees the means of production not only against the state power but also against the capitalist exploitation, to mobilize the broadest proletarian layer to bring to an end the political havoc that has been happening in Cuba, Lebanon, Ethiopia, and Eswatini also. The demands have been anchored very, very clearly by the left in South Africa, keep left included. That what we need is an introduction to the basic income grant with a living wage to those who are employed, amnesty to all those who are arrested during the looting, a compensation to all the workers who have been affected. And also the state should create job creation through massive public works program to address housing and public infrastructure. Manda, comrades. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. You forgot to introduce yourself, so if you can introduce yourself. And we are recording this event. I hope everyone is okay with that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Lebogang from Kiplef, South Africa.
Okay. Thank you. So, Ibis, what is happening in Ethiopia, Ibis? And please introduce yourself to us.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Ibis Kasa. I'm based at the Institute for African Alternatives in Cape Town, South Africa. So here, of course, I thank you very much for this. And I'm also so glad that we started off the discussion and trying to wrap our heads around what has been happening in South Africa. And as a way to also reflect on what's happening in Ethiopia. And I think that we had conceptualized this event way earlier before the protests ignited in South Africa, the more recent protests, the looting, and the chaotic scenes that we all bore witness to. But as confusing as this whole situation was, I think that there was also an attempt for us to step back and then just reflect and to avoid the trap of trying to understand the dynamics at play, seeing them within the colonial borders, but also to think about what the dynamics are, and then to draw, if you will, an understanding of the processes underlying it. And I think I'm positive that our conversation today will take us forward in thinking through those questions, those problems, and whatever theorization one may make of the struggles that people have been waging to survive, to hold communities together, and the social reproduction crisis that people are facing, have been facing day in, day out, exacerbated by the COVID conditions, but also the ways in which we can we can try and analyze the processes as they are unfolding. So let me just go straight into the presentation. So here in the Ethiopian context, it's been also a very complex crisis. We thought what we were seeing in Ethiopia was a fast-moving crisis, but South Africa showed us how rapid a crisis could unfold. But in many ways, also equally complex and diverse set of interests playing themselves out. There's been a dominant Western narrative by the media outlets and also by the EU, echoed by the EU, the United States, and pressures from the IMF and World Bank that a particular position and perspective on the ongoing crisis in Ethiopia. There was also positions about there was a prevailing argument that there was an oppressive central government viciously repressing an ethnic minority group which is defending defending its autonomy, that being the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, and that the civil war had led to sexual violence, genocide, and all the criticism was heavily skewed in relation to the government. And it was a very easy argument to make if you knew nothing about the context of Ethiopia, and just think about a very vicious central government and a province within that space where an ethnic minority is seeking to also defend its autonomy. That's being the prevailing view, and it's also stretching when you go to issues about securing the energy sovereignty, finding itself in a peace and security process within the UN Security Council, as we recently witnessed in relation to the Nile conflict with Egypt and Sudan. But all of these conflicts are very much, all of these crises and issues and concerns are very much interconnected. An alternative narrative that tends to come out of the Ethiopian civil society, and also has been articulated by the Ethiopian government to a certain extent, is trying to draw on a bit more on some of the facts as they've unfolded, instead of going for the simple dominant Western narrative, but thinking about the ways in which you have an authoritarian ethnic minority government that has dominated Ethiopian politics and economy for 30 years, for almost 30 years, and with having its own cases of genocide, massacres, and also over the 30-year period, the losses of economic and political power by the dominant Tigrayan People's Liberation Front dominated coalition government that was in power for almost 30 years. And the ways in which they had been aggrieved by the reform process that's underway by the incumbent government, which is now led by Prime Minister Abiy, and also the way in which on November 4, they preemptively slaughtered unarmed federal troops and triggered a war and genocidal attacks on ethnic minorities in Western Tigray. Very little mention is made of the massacres that occurred, the genocidal attacks that occurred soon after the November 4 attack in Western Tigray in Maikadra. And that's very deliberate. I mean, there was a public meeting where we had basically a Western analyst who basically was arguing that he doesn't care about the killings in Maikadra. His only concern is about what goes on in relation to what they were arguing was occurring in relation to the genocides ongoing in Tigray, according to them. So there was a very clear, overt and naked bias that was being expressed publicly. But how can we understand the process that we've seen unfold? They are not very, it's not a very simple story. For one, you'd have to think about almost 3,000 years of history. Of course, that's a very complex, wide period of time to look at for any historical process and so on. This is basically talking about even before the colonial encounter, if you will. So very much so a question of the empire building and also the tensions between the center and the periphery that plays itself out over a very long period of time. And in the ongoing conflict, you have the TPLF evoking this 3,000-year history of tension between the center and the periphery. And we also have to think about the formation of the modern state and the way it concentrated all of these crises. But the particular ways that at the colonial encounter and the Great African Adwa victory of 1896, there was a particular way in which all the divided peoples came together in a war, which was won against imperialism. Therefore, basically striking a part of the continent that was able to prevent the colonial onslaught and bringing to, marking the end of the scramble of Africa, but also being a source of inspiration across the Black world. But at the same time, in as much as all this hope was being generated, it also increased the centralized control that Minilik and Taitu asserted at the center, and it amplified tensions with the regional feudal forces, and particularly in Tigray. So These tensions existed and the struggles continued until they came together again in the 1970s, in the lead up to the 1974 revolution, which led to the overthrow of the monarchy. And in this process, you had different groups, student groups, different tendencies coming together, but mainly they can be split into two threads. One section, if you could think of as more nationalistic in their orientation, and another that was more thinking about the oppressed peoples of Ethiopia, and bringing in an understanding of the ways in which certain groups were marginalized in the monarchy and were not as dominant as others, and their ability to basically access resources and power and so on. So all of this trying to bring itself to kind of shape the context within which the new direction of the state. But at the end of the 1974 revolution, you had a military government that was able to, a dictatorship that was able to assert itself, linking itself ultimately to Marxism, Leninism ideology and to Russia in the Cold War period. But at the same time also basically crushing the opposition from groups that sought to bring onto the table the rights of cultural minorities, if you will, other language groups that are not as dominant in the governance structures and so on. So by 1991, you have a lot of these groups basically focusing on overthrowing the military regime. And the civil war comes to an end with the overthrow of the Derg by armed groups, and with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and Eritrean People's Liberation Front playing an important, crucial role in that process. But they were not the only ones. By no means were they the only ones. There are ways in which we can reflect on all of these processes, and I think there would not be enough time to go into all of this, but I think that there's a need to reflect on the principles of autonomy, self-reliance, self-determination that in many ways shaped and freedom that basically shaped the different ways in which you have particular groups that sought to assert their own autonomy. And these are questions that were actually brought up within the young people in the late 60s, 1970s, who are also reflecting on this. Walali Makonnan's writing on this is particularly important. He said the revolution can start anywhere. It can even be secessionist to begin with, led by the progressive forces and peasants. But the final aim has to be the liberation of Ethiopian mass with due consideration to the economic, cultural independence of all nationalities. But once again, you see that he's looking to the writings of Lenin and the particular context that Lenin will be writing, using particular categories like the nations, nationalities. And that's important because one has to ask the hard question whether these categories are even appropriate in the Ethiopian context. It's also important to understand that the TPLF itself was grappling with these questions. There wasn't a monotonous kind of hegemonic kind of position within the group. There were wide-ranging debates, and these were a longer spectrum, thinking about Tigrayan rights in a liberated and democratic united Ethiopia towards the extreme right, which is more about secession from Ethiopia. So, but once in government, it became very clear that it would have been more beneficial to be able to control the levels of government and to dominate the entire country. And the group that was thinking more of creating an ethno-nationalist governance system was able to dominate the narrative. But this is much more complex than that. And I think that we don't fully understand what happened in those heady days in 1991, but I think that some of the people on this call actually were part of the processes and part of that transition period when the Derg was overthrown. So therefore, they can give us more insights into what happened. But I think that the underlying logic of it is that there's an assumption that there are various kinds of colonialism, and Ethiopia itself contained with it a variation of colonialism. And there was also an acceptance of rigid categories of nations and nationalities imposed on contexts where there are fluid identities and dynamic forms of interdependence that are completely ignored. migration patterns. That's like a complexity that's disposed of. And the implication, of course, is that in its extreme form, it justifies genocide. There's also a drive towards simple narratives, labeling of some as victims and others as oppressors on the basis of simple language, language spoken, cultural identity. And ultimately, there's no class analysis. There's no understanding of the forms of capitalism in Ethiopia, and no explanation of how inequalities are reproduced. So I'm going to play this quick video, if the chair will permit. To explain, this is the TPLF when they entered Ethiopia. A report from the CNN.
Ibis, we can't hear the...
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think it has to do with the sharing. Let me, oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, okay. So basically, let me just explain. So that was essentially a footage from Addis Ababa in 1991 when the rebel army had entered Ethiopia, and basically was trying to find out from people what they felt about that situation. And their responses were that they don't have support for the regime, for the rebels who had entered. Just so that you see it for yourself. So the report, the translator basically asks them, you can express your happiness on seeing what has happened in the country, on what is going on. So that in itself shows you the process in itself. Of course, it's in the product as a product of war. It's not the product of an uprising where people are thinking of transforming society. They have no say in the process, and must think through the fact that since the monarchy until to date, until that period, it was essentially authoritarian dictatorship kind of a space. So what's important here? On the extreme right, you have Ambassador Herman Cohen, then Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. And he is very crucial because in that period when there was a transition, you had Gorbachev in Russia, it's going through its glasnost process, and you have basically Gorbachev, according to Ambassador Cohen, asking Americans to step in and resolve the crisis in Ethiopia, as in other parts of Africa. And in this moment, essentially what happened was that once Ambassador Cohen was on the table, you had the TPLF, at the time there being a ceasefire process and negotiations ongoing in London, the US gave the TPLF the go-ahead to enter Addis Ababa. So the government was disabled because it had given its word to have a ceasefire, and the TPLF just roared in. So there was no resistance to the TPLF, virtually no resistance to the TPLF from taking over Addis Ababa. So it was regarded then historically as a bloodless coup. And of course, in this period, South Africa is going through its own transition process, which is important historically. So what does Ambassador Cohen do today? What does he have to say today? Well, he tweets a hell of a lot on social media, and he keeps on, this is his analysis of the situation. He says, Ethiopia will never be stable and democratic until every ethnic state manages its own affairs, except for foreign policy, defense, currency, and trade. So the United States is very much, if you will, is very much invested in the TPLF. And we must understand this in relation to the Adwa moment. If you think about it historically, that's a moment when people across all differences unite in order to confront a wider, an external force. But the TPLF's whole, the particular section of TPLF that has dominated politics for the last 27 years has been one of division. And it's clear, he goes on to say, it's clear from recent events that further armed conflicts, the further armed conflict will not bring peace to Ethiopia. There should be an all-parties conference chaired by the AU. Now he's making this, it sounds very sensible and really great, but he's making this proposition on July 1, 9 days from the announcement of when the elections had taken place and the Progress Party was on course to win the elections, or was later announced to have won the elections 9 days after this tweet was put out. So it shows you the ways in which the PP, even though the Progress Party is known as a liberal party, but at the same time, the kind of force, countervailing force that it represents seems to have ignited other kinds of responses externally. And I find that to be notable. It's important to recall what the nature of the TPLF and the Ethiopian People's Democratic Front, when they were in power as the coalition dominated by TPLF. You had a problem of illicit financial flows with under-invoicing of exports, under and over-invoicing of exports and imports, up to $2.2 to $3 billion lost annually for about 3 decades. Foreign aid at its height was $3.5 billion a year. TPLF it's an open secret that they have offshore accounts of about $30 billion, which they've been drawing upon in this period. And the state-owned enterprises were very much a source of their loot. So thinking about particularly one key, if you will, conglomerate is the Medtech. It's a military hardware manufacturing entity with about 12,000 employees. In 2014, labor unions focused on demanding respect for worker rights, but they were heavily criticized by the regime then, that they weren't supposed to bargain on the basis of rights. They were accused to being wedded to the previous regime, military dictatorship, and their focus should be on the attaining of middle income status. The CEO at the time was Brigadier General Knife Daniel. So this is very much embedded within the military. It is a military outfit. And he was arrested in 2018 after a parliamentary review revealed extensive graft, overpricing and international procurements over $2 billion. In some cases, there was overpricing of about 400%. So you can see the ways in which they were using these structures to be able to accumulate wealth. And then we also see the Industrial Global Trading and Federation organizes in Ethiopia, and they particularly in the industrial parks, and they've shown the continuation in terms of repression of labor organization in both private and state corporations that are ongoing. There's been a high turnover of labor wildcat strikes. Yes. Okay, so I will conclude now.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how did we get to the point where we are at now? There were popular protests from the mid-2013-2014 against land grabbing in urban spaces mainly, but not only. It was mainly about gentrification, rising cost of living, and it's intensified in 2016. And these were heavily, brutally repressed. But it's reached a point where the TPLF, EPRDF could no longer contain the anger of people, particularly under the Oromo protests organizing. That was very key dynamic, but it also triggered protests in other parts of the country. There was messages of solidarity between the Amhara people protesting the Amhara region with the Oromo people's struggle. So there was a basis for unity. But then ultimately it leads to the EPRDF doing something completely unexpected. It literally self-corrected. The TPLF lost dominance in the structure. The OPDO, Oromo People's Party, was able to take over. And through that process, ultimately led to the dissolution of EPRDF itself. and the setting up of the Prosperity Party. TPLF refuses ideological differences, and the need to continue to dominate. They retreat to Mekelle in the Tigray region. And then you have the attack on November 4. Of course, things have developed since then, and I'm happy to engage with discussions and explain more later. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you, Edith, for shedding light on this and for the extensive revelations that you have given us. Jechi, you introduce yourself and then you start your presentation.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Jifa. My name is Jechi Tano. I'm a member of the International Socialist Organization and the Socialist Students and Workers Network here in Ghana, along with Jifa, who I noticed refused to identify herself as a member of that organization. Thank you for all of you for participating. Thanks to Comrade Lebo from Keep Left in South Africa, and of course to Hibist. I think both of them have provided an excellent summary in the short time that they have of what they themselves and all of us acknowledge are pretty complex circumstances, which have been long in the making, which have deep roots, and even if, in terms of the immediate events that are unfolding, different interests are trying to, take advantage of the situation and so on. There's a couple of things that I just wanted to focus a bit more generally on the sub-theme that unites these two cases, which is the crisis of ethnicity and nationalism and the crisis of state and society in Africa. And I think that, as well, luck, misfortune, happy accident or unhappy accident, as the case may be, would have it, these two countries, if those of us who are old enough to remember, right at the beginning of the 21st century, these were among the two countries which are held up as exemplars of a new renaissance in Africa. At the time, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, who was also the TPLF leader, Meles Zenawi, and Thabo Mbeki were the two, if you like, pillars, two poster boys, poster faces of this renaissance. Seen as a new generation of African leadership, which can carve out a new space and a new respect and a new dignity for Africa, can assure the refurbishment of African economies within the context of globalization, can also ensure that their societies and their governance regimes in their societies are, increasingly democratic, accountable, have all the institutions, if you like, of low intensity, electoral competition and so on and so forth. Of course, as the case of Ethiopia, and as Hibist has shown with the case of Ethiopia, that was always, breached, more in the breach than in the, sorry, I've forgotten the phrase, but never quite exactly the same. But the benefit of joining these two countries this way is that they show, two different approaches to neoliberalism in Africa. I think Lebo's point that neoliberalism is at the source of the crisis in South Africa is a fundamental one, and one that we should underline. I would argue that neoliberalism too is a source of a deep part of the problem in Ethiopia, although, as it began to show, taking a slightly more circuitous route, a lot more entwined with a power play in terms of the structure of political governance and the restructuring of political governance within Ethiopia and so on. Let me start with Ethiopia, and I'll come back to South Africa. I want to start with Ethiopia because, not simply because it is, a more typical sub-Saharan African country, but also because of its own, importance. Okay, South Africa, yes, is the most sophisticated economy in Africa. If you take away, some of the misleading indicators that the macro figures show, which puts Nigeria at the head of, the biggest economy in Africa. I think any real reading of economies would put South Africa as the most important economy in Africa, and by some way. Nonetheless, I think a country like Ethiopia is extremely important. Number one, it's a huge country. It has 112 million or so people, second biggest population in Africa. It is a huge military power in East Africa, It was a big partner in terms of the war on terror and the conditions that Hibis has described from the 1974 onwards, especially with the civil war that was launched in the mid-1970s by the likes of TPLF and the Eritrean and so on, has meant that there's been a deep scale of militarization, for a long time within Ethiopia itself. That is what makes it such a power. Although, as we saw in the case of the, if you like, for some commentators, the defeat of the federal forces in Tigray itself, it shows you that even giants can have clay feet in that respect. Of course, it is also the case that Tigray, as a fraction of the Ethiopian ruling class writ large, is a particularly militarized one. And the background that Hibis gave would very easily allow us to understand that in terms of the distribution of military assets within Ethiopia itself, the TPLF regime and whatever is the remnant of that TPLF regime, which sat at the head of the federal government for almost 2 decades, has actually maintained a lot of the most important military assets, installations, and so on of Ethiopia itself, and therefore it is a very powerful force within its own right. So Ethiopia is important, no doubt about it. But it's also important for another reason. And I think I want to touch on this a bit, on the question of the economy. And in the last slide also, Hibis began to talk about that. I think that, if you were looking, it is very hard to look for an economic miracle under neoliberalism in Africa. But if you were looking for one, it would have to be Ethiopia. For a very simple reason. Ethiopia has had the most unbroken path of growth from the 1990s up until 2019 thereabouts. In fact, for the decade after 2010, it was the fastest growing economy in the entire world, more than China, more than anywhere else. So and we can see what that has meant in terms of the fact that it has reconstituted large elements of its agrarian sector. It has revived its agrarian export sector. It has begun to make inroads in terms of the global value chains of coffee, which is its main agricultural product. It has set itself up in terms of, began to diversify into different areas such as light manufacturing, in terms of leather. It is one of the leading growth areas in terms of textiles and garments in Africa at the moment, and so on. And in fact, if you look at the length and breadth of Ethiopia, part of this formulation of this ethnic national federation of different, ethnic dominated states, and an attempt to have some fair balance. I'm not saying there was any success. Attempt to have some fair balance and a more spread out economic development. You find that things like this shift towards manufacturing and industrialization. You find that industrial parks, for example, dot the different parts of the country. But the industrial parks are a good story to start with, because what the industrial parks show is that you can build the infrastructure, but you might not necessarily succeed in attracting the investment. You can build the infrastructure. It might not necessarily speak of the developed capacities within the economy in terms of skills, in terms of technology, in terms of capital, and so on and so forth. So that the model that Ethiopia pursued, and in terms of the bridging, the evenness of the domestic aggregate growth within the domestic economy itself, obviously it's a very poor country, like most of Africa, starting from perhaps a lower base in terms of poverty than many other African countries, but the state actually maintained a degree of control over the process of investment within Ethiopia itself. So infrastructure growth, construction and infrastructure growth has been a big driving force. And the infrastructure growth, for example, in key aspects has been done on the basis of this spread in terms of evenness and so on. So if you take, let's say, higher education, every of the states that make up the federation in Uganda have seen an exponential growth in terms of public education, third level education, and so on and so forth. All kinds of universities. I'm not talking about the quality and so on. But what that tells you is that one of the mechanisms for holding together the ruling class as a whole in this process of this ethnic and nationalist federation was that the state being at the center of investment and the key driving force for generating, aggregate demand and internal growth within the country itself, allowed a mediation that those different fractions would have a share of those resources. The kind of thing that Hibis is talking about in terms of the turn that has taken place towards a greater look outward to free up the economy. Hibis, for example, mentions telecommunications and finance and so on, to free up the economy, to allow foreign private direct investment and so on and so forth, threatens that balance. Because those at the center of the federal state have in terms of their structural and systemic capacities to contract loans, to oversee investment agreements, and so on and so forth, the different parts of the federation clearly do not have. So that the kinds of investment that would have been assured to those in the different sections of the federation is no longer guaranteed. And when that happens, having the power to hold people to the bargain, or to restructure the terms of the bargain in your benefit, having that power, including the potential threat of force or violence or that military power, is important. And that's one dimension of trying to understand this thing. To go back to this question of public investment, let's understand a couple of other things. Ethiopia is as I said, yes, there has been a big push towards, but controlled push towards the entry and selective entry of foreign direct investment. It's not been a wholesale neoliberal agenda. It is a neoliberal regime right from the start, right from Meles's time. That's why he was hailed as this poster boy for African inheritance. It was neoliberal in the sense that it sought to exploit the openings that its position would allow it, and the so-called comparative and competitive advantage that its economy would allow it within the framework of the internationalization of trade, the liberalization of finance, and so on and so forth. It managed to parlay its image as one that has suffered in terms of all kinds of turmoil, the famine in the 1970s, the civil war, and so on and so forth. Now it has finally achieved a stable and reliable leadership. It managed to parlay those aid relationships without necessarily groveling in the same way that most African governments tend to do, or are seen or understood to do. And the fact that it was a regime that took power by overthrowing the state itself and having the military and so on and so forth, basically loyal to it, meant that in terms of the bureaucracy, in terms of the cadre that had been built up through the years of struggle and so on and so forth, the ruling class as a whole in Ethiopia seemed to be able to speak with a degree of coherence, with one voice, in a way in which, again, it's missing. I mean, Ghana, certainly, it's a far shabbier operation if you think about the quality of the messaging of the ruling class and its different divisions and so on and so forth. There was a lot more apparent, maybe more than real, apparent coherence with in terms of the Ethiopia and so on. So much so that for a lot of people, this was the makings of what they call a developmental state in Africa. And it's an important point. It's an important point to see the degree to which the Meles regime had that type of support, not simply from Western Herman Cohen and so on and so forth, but very much from a lot of Pan-Africanists, a lot of people who thought that the way forward in terms of Africa, in terms of its progress, in terms of its developmental transition, would be a developmental state, one that doesn't necessarily grovel and is craven in front of foreign capital and so on and so forth. But as I said, Ethiopia is like most African countries, is starting from a low economic base. It's generally a very poor country. So when you have a situation where Ethiopia is one of the countries with the third highest share of public investment per GDP anywhere in the world, but it's also one of the countries with the sixth lowest share of foreign investment than anywhere in the world, that tells you that upon all the infrastructure investments that have been developed, including this, this thing that is the headlines now, the dam, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and so on, and impressive on a technical level, a very impressive feat, including the public mobilization for its financing and so on. We can question some of the methods, but let's leave that aside. The point is that it has reached the upper limit of that particular path of the curious combination of economic nationalism with neoliberalism. Now, economic nationalism, by which I mean the ruling class in Ethiopia trying to retain control of the processes of growth and trying within its own terms to mediate how that growth is balanced between its different regions, its different interest groups, and so on and so forth. What that tells us is another thing. You see, when you look at the 1974 struggles of the student movement, left struggles that Hibes talked about, you look at the left at the time, including the one she quoted, I've forgotten his name, the one who said liberation can come from everywhere, anywhere. It can be a secessionist movement, it can be a peasant movement, as long as it is liberating the Ethiopian mass as a whole. It doesn't tell us what the Ethiopian mass are being liberated from. So the only conclusion you can draw is that being liberated from foreign domination. Again, it is a radical nationalist thing rather than a class-based, despite the mention of peasants and workers, rather than a class-based, it is not the liberation of workers and peasants from their Ethiopian masters, be they Tigrayan, be they Eritrean at the time, be they Amharic, be they Oromo, or whatever it is. It is about the same agenda of national liberation, so to speak. It reminds me of one thing. If we understand a huge chunk of the African nationalist movement in the 1940s and 1950s, this was the model. They took as a ready-made, a given, the same structure of ethnic growth and ethnic political arrangements that the colonial masters had put in place. In fact, one element that Hibis missed out was the role of the British government after the so-called liberation of Ethiopia from Italian rule in 1943 onwards in restructuring this ethnic. In fact, one of the reasons why it is so rigid is precisely because of the way in which, without the influence of the Ethiopian emperor and so on and so forth, the British actually manipulated this in a very traditional way in which they are done throughout Africa and so on. So when you look at it from the point of view, the old traditional ruling class, which was dominant, the would-be ruling class, which was dominant in the nationalist movements in the 1940s and 1950s, for the most part, they were content to cobble together a nationalist movement made up of the leaderships of the different ethnic groups. And that this is the basis of participation and constructing a national leadership. So they, in a sense, they gave a new lease of life to the process of ethnic division itself. Ghana is a clear case in point. Until the arrival of the radical wing of the nationalist movement, driven by petty traders, small capital, teachers, unions, workers, farmers, and so on, led by Kwame Nkrumah. Until you had that, what you had was a cobbling together of the Northern People's Party, the Ashanti this, the Ga that, and so on and so forth, and the different fragments of that coming together. The reason why it was easy to do so is that these were the big chiefs, the big merchants, those with any degree of capital who had thrived under the cocoa economy and so on, under colonialism. These were the local bourgeoisie, so to speak. The reason why you would have had a greater pull to a more universalizing agenda, the type represented by Kwame Nkrumah and co, was that this was a rising class. It was not the proto-bourgeoisie, so to speak. So to be able to ensure that it rises, it must unify a wider set of forces. If today we are in a circumstance where the Ethiopian ruling class finds it necessary, those who constitute the Ethiopian government, find it necessary to go back to a model of ethnic nationalism, what that tells you is that we are no longer talking about ruling middle-class, radical middle-class nationalists. We are talking about the fact that a ruling class has arrived and is there and is here to stay in Africa. So any attempt at liberation, any attempt at a critique of ethnicity, for that middle class, that universalizing middle class, radical middle class wing, the Kwame Nkrumahs and so on and so forth, they could dismiss ethnicity without engaging in it. They could dismiss it out of this some primordial, feudal something. Once we build this new modern state, it will die of its own thing. So they never really attacked the fact that it has a real material basis. It has a real material basis in the way labor is mobilized in terms of social reproduction, in terms of all kinds of communal labor, in terms of the cheap labor, and sometimes the subordinated labor, half and free labor that is brought to the mines, to public infrastructure, and so on and so forth. Critical factor. It is important in terms of land relations. In Ghana, for example, there are areas where if you do not have ethnic roots or ethnic tradition, the terms of your use of land, for example, are entirely different from somebody else. It's like paying a totally different tax regime simply on the basis of your ethnicity. So that is a hugely unresolved question. It is a hugely unresolved question. And when you talk in terms of developmental state, when you compare that, for example, and let me make a brief detour here, you compare that, for example, with the experience in Southeast Asia, where because of the particular character of late top breakneck speed Japanese colonialism, for example, in Korea, the middle element that held the land had to be wiped out. When the United States military took over in Japan itself and in Korea itself, they also accelerated that process. So by the time you had nationalists rising to the fore of, let's say, the Korean ruling class, the likes of General Park and so on and so forth, all those intermediaries, the traditional leaders, the big landowners, had been cleared away. The capacity of the state to aggregate on its own without all the leakages that the so-called parallel economy is not really a parallel economy, because the present economy is a very modern economy. That's why I mentioned cocoa. That's why, so it was established, tobacco, wherever it is that you look at, it was established in the 19th century as part of the metropolitan industrial outreach of ensuring raw material supplies and so on. In a situation of labor shortage, part of the heritage of the slave trade, you couldn't just drive people off the land. The ratio between land and labor was a lot, lot less intense. You couldn't simply drive people off the land. You had to ensure that they generate surpluses, even if they still have access or some degree of control to some independent means of production, for example, land. They will be grafted into a system where whatever they produce comes under the control of merchant capital. That merchant capital is closely tied to metropolitan financial capital, is closely tied to metropolitan industrial capital, and so on and so forth. So the peasant economy that we talk about, there is nothing inherently traditional in it in terms of Africa, like going back 800 years. That's untrue. It came into its own fundamentally in the 19th century. It is an extremely modern form. And that is why ethnicity, the term that, even though Hibis talked in terms of in terms of, a 3,000-year history and so on and so forth. I think the turning points in the modern era are more decisive, in terms of the refurbishment of ethnic politics and so on. But as I said, if the middle class and those with a radical nationalist agenda are now part of the ruling class proper, then the ethnic question cannot be resolved. It cannot be resolved because the process of neoliberalism in Africa requires a degree of ensuring that even as people are dispossessed in terms of their land and so on and so forth, that is done in a backdoor surreptitious way. And that those same people are able to reproduce some minimum level of their own reproduction without relying, so that things like the absence of a welfare state or the minimum formal employment opportunities available and so on and so forth do not kind of collapse, or the large-scale depth of crisis that we are seeing unfold in South Africa, for example. And as I've tried to explain, not all nationalism can address the question of ethnicity, because nationalism too can be an aggregation of different ruling class fractions which actually seek in terms of this. So we come back to a final point that I want to make. Fortunately, I can't go back to the South Africa question immediately. I've run out of time. Hopefully, in the discussion, others will. Hey, who's this muscular fellow trying to, frighten us with his?
Wrap up, please.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, the essential point is this. I think that we are at a critical stage where the only way for African capitalism to continue to be viable in terms of the era of globalization is to continue to assure driving down cheaper and cheaper labor. It does not have the capital, it does not have the technology to compete on the basis of increasing productivity. It can only do so on the basis of a growing level. What the hell is this? It can only do so on the basis of growing recourse to the plunder that is involved in absolute surplus value production rather than relative surplus value production. You cannot press people's conditions down that way without finding a countervailing hegemony. If those same people are still reliant partially on the degree that is a question of nationality, it's a question of the representation of my tribe, of my ethnic group, of my geographical area, of my religious minority, and so on and so forth, that type of hegemony that the ruling class can exercise basically is now, even it was always convenient, now it is a necessity. It is an absolute necessity when the scramble for raw materials and natural resources in Africa, especially since the commodity boom of the 21st century, plus the growing climate crisis, puts that more at a premium than ever before. And for that reason, I think that to address the question of ethnicity, to address the question to go beyond the limits of the nationalism that we have, including, by the way, Pan-African nationalism, it's only a class solution that is necessary. If you take the situation Chair, I'll end on this point, half a minute. If we take the situation in Ethiopia, some people have referred to it in terms of Lenin's issue about national self-determination, national liberation, national self-determination. I think, in a sense, Hibis was right. We should be a bit suspicious of that formula, because our chief interest is how do working people find the power to fight, which is the framework that gives them the maximum power to fight, and in the process of that fighting, go beyond themselves to make link with a wider condition of working people across the spectrum of all of those who increasingly have to yield a greater and greater share of their livelihood and of their product as surplus value to somebody else. If people integrate, we're demanding that we want a stronger part of our national autonomy within the federation, because that will allow us to take on our ruling class more, and that will be able to defeat them more in the same way that those in the Oromo will be able to do, or an American will be able to do. It is different. And that is not what is happening. So for those who have gone along quietly with the fact that, yes, they are oppressed minorities, they have had no answer to the fact that even on the university campuses as we speak, the university campuses that I talked about in terms of the dispersal of infrastructure across Ethiopia, they have become hotbeds of ethnic radicalization. Hotbeds of ethnic radicalization. Nothing else undercutting it. Hibis described the process where from 2013, 2014 onwards, it was the process of gentrification, the expansion of Addis and its metropolis into, knocking into rural lands, changing all of that. This is a crisis of neoliberalism. It was never fought as a question of neoliberalism. It was fought as an ethnic identity problem and so on and so forth. So I think, comrades, the question that we have to, you see, when we look, if I am right at all, to any degree that I may be right, that I think the question of ethnicity and identity politics has taken on a new meaning, a new salience, and being weaponized in a new way, then I think the social justice activists as a whole, working people wherever they are, and in particular socialists, can no longer simply condemn it as some. We have to engage with its material roots, why it is able to reproduce itself materially and also hegemonically in terms of ideas. That means we can't simply be talking about ethnicity and xenophobia. We need real movements explicitly against those. those real movements to take root within the working classes wherever they are. It's important. In the same way as you find the global left in many parts of the world, there's long-term, permanent anti-racist movements and so on. So it's time that actually we did that. We also need to be able to challenge more dramatically, more forcefully, this notion of two things. And I'll just mention it and here. Pan-Africanism at the level of nationalism. We have to be able to challenge that. I am not a Pan-Africanist at that level at all. I'm an internationalist. If that increasing unity across Africa, I'm for that. But I'm not a Pan-Africanist in the way in which it is normally meant. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we must also know that ultimately the enemy is at home. You see, when you are faced with the kind of economic crisis that even South Africa can have, or the other variant of neoliberalism Ethiopia can have, and you have, let's say, the injustices in the world system in terms of debt and trade and so on, people will recourse, even hard left solid people go back to the popular descriptions of neocolonialism and so on and so forth, and puppet rulers. Again, let's be careful. That to me is a slippery slope towards retrogression. Things are a bit more complicated, but we have to have the patience and the vigor, but at the same time, the uncompromising intent and agenda of burying to the heart of actually existing capitalism in Africa, understanding that working classes, like any class, aren't simply come about, they are made into being. Lenin described a situation where there's a difference between a class in itself and a class for itself. What you can say about Ethiopia, what you can say in large measure about South Africa too, is that this moment of class for itself is yet to arrive. Even though we have a more denser, more vibrant, more diverse civil society in South Africa who are able to rise to the occasion in terms of trying to chart a way forward in a way that's totally absent in Ethiopia. This is the task wherever you are, whether in Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana, or wherever else. Class politics from below, understanding the mechanisms of exploitation as clearly as we can, tying into the hegemonic agenda around ethnicity, identity, LGBT, religion, and so on and so forth, dealing with fundamental issues such as property rights, land question, and so on and so forth. That is the heart of the nub of the problem here. Our ruling classes can totter along as long as they have
that pussy 445, nigga.
Our ruling classes can totter along as long as they have something to bargain with from the point of view of global capitalism, and as long as they have super exploitation to pursue, as long as they have other mechanisms of surplus value extraction, we can totter from crisis to crisis. In the case of Ethiopia, I think that's what's going to happen, because other militias and other regions are mobilizing to fight the Tigrayers as well. This could be in for a long, horrible time. And it's been extremely difficult. But wherever you are, that you have the room to whisper or to say something a bit more louder than a whisper and bring one or two people together in the understanding of that class analysis, that is the job that you have. That is the job that we have. Anything else doesn't add up to an adequate response to the kind of crisis that we face in society and state in Africa today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jechi. Thanks so much, all the three panelists. Now the floor is ours, everyone. Questions, you can put your comment questions in the chat, or you raise your electronic hand up and we start going. So questions, comments, additions are welcome. Who wants to go first? Are you able to raise your hand at your end, or hello, everyone. Are we there?
Yes, we are here.
Okay,
people have raised their hands.
People have raised their hands, yeah.
Oh, I can't see it here. Okay, now I can see. So the first person, Faisal Baba, please.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chair, and thanks to the presenters. I just want to make 2 quick points. The first one really is a broad point about the question of identity and, in particular, ethnicity. I think it's important to recognize that ethnicity is not something which exists outside of class relations, especially in Africa. Some of these ethnicities that we have today are fairly recent in terms of their existence. Some of them were actually carved as processes of colonial statecraft, and they were meant to serve particular purposes. In terms of the classification of people as laboring classes, but also within different emerging industries under colonialism. And so one has to really understand ethnicities as things that are shifting, right? Ethnicities shift as societies change, and that ethnicities do not have an unchanging history. Now, this is very important because we have a resurgence of ethnic politics. I mean, even within the section of the left, that people will say, no, but these are questions that are trans-class, they go beyond class. But the idea of capitalism as something which is malleable simply means that capitalism makes use of whatever cleavage it can find useful. So if it's racial identity, it will make use of racial identity, ethnic identity, gender difference, sexual orientation, and so on. The final point, the second and final point I want to make is about what is happening in South Africa. So I'm in South Africa at the moment. And what this moment I think reveals, of course, there's a great deal of complexity, is the result of lack of organization. I think the left was completely taken unawares, number one. But secondly, our complete lack of mobilization was exposed greatly in that we were scrambling to understand what was happening, And this for me is really important because we had a phase in South Africa from 2015 where an argument was put forward that, what we need are spontaneous uprisings. Organizations are a thing of the past. Now, if there is any lesson to take out of what is going on at the moment, is that actually that is a false thesis. That now more than ever, we need to organize on an ongoing basis, in that change doesn't happen out of nowhere, but also popular mobilization can go anyway, can go in any direction. So at times these uprisings could be mobilized and channeled into very regressive endeavors, right? And so the point about constantly building organization is something that the present moment makes urgent for all of us. So those are my 2 points, Comrade Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Faisal. And Mami.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just to introduce myself, my name is Mame. I am from the US. I live in Denver, Colorado. It is so good to be amongst you guys. This is my first time joining this meeting, but I have thoroughly enjoyed the presentation and every information that was contained in it. I'm so grateful to see the passion and the compassion within the presenters. It just made me feel like, where have I been? Why was I not involved in something like this? Because I am so much Pan-Africanist, if that is the correct word. But it is early morning here, so you have to forgive me. I haven't even had a coffee yet. What I wanted to include in this amazing discussion is we cannot undermine, and I don't want to repeat everything that was just said. This is just unbelievable. Things have been said, and thank you so very much for the presentation, in particular, the presentation on what's going on in Ethiopia. I am from Ethiopia. We all know it's been out in the social media. So I want to raise 2 points, the social media and what the US has to benefit from what it is that is happening in Ethiopia. We will be foolish not to think that the hand of the US government, the US media is in it, politics is in it. This isn't the first time that the Western tries to dismantle Africa, and at this time, the focus is on Ethiopia. I've been saying something for a while. Today, maybe Ethiopia, but it's just not going to end in Ethiopia. I can tell you that. So Pan-African, Africans, all of us, we need to really come together and be a positive voice. I think there is absolute room for individualism to some degree. I think there is an absolute opportunity for us to be our unique individual country, individual custom, individual ethnicity, whatever it may be. But when it comes to the Horn of Africa, there's got to be a coming together. There's got to be a unification, a unity that even the Western wouldn't dare try to separate. When it comes to those common grounds that we talk about, economic growth, resources that Africa just naturally contains within itself, and how it is just people are like different places are salivating over what we have and what we don't recognize, what we don't necessarily utilize in a manner that it benefits the country itself. I think one of the presenters towards the end mentioned trust, mentioned so much stuff. I can't even keep up. There was so much that was said. But what I'm trying to say right now really is it is more important for this kind of Pan-African agenda to advance, to be out there, and for the Western world to hear that when it comes to certain things, Africa, one way or another, as divided as we may be or may seem to be, we know how to come together. We know how to really say, enough is enough. We cannot be deceived by the fact that this whole thing is just going to be contained in one area, in one country. Like I said, it had just happened to be Ethiopia at this time. We all know the misinformation, the disinformation, what the social media is doing, what the Western is doing. Thank you so very much for the presenter that actually did a presentation on Ethiopia. It's so refreshing to see that, facts are there. The honest to God information, the honest fact is out there. What TPLF is doing is really trying to maintain power one way or another. They didn't get it by anybody's vote. They kind of forced themselves in there and they maintained themselves there. They were a government within a government. Whatever government they named, it was a facade for the last 27 years. They were advancing their own agenda. They were, they were looting the government from inside out. And as it was mentioned, the offshore accounts, that's what they're using right now to buy the social media. And you know what social media is, what a media is, right? Especially right now, their own people, their own community. I mean, anyone and everyone who can be lavished with money is going to spew whatever. I mean, do they care? No. Does it impact them? No. Is it really destroying a country? Is it destroying people? It's actually creating war somewhere and people are dying as a result? That's not going to be impacting them. They could care less. So our voices really need to come right up, rise above all that and kind of dismantle the misinformation and disinformation. What I want to really stress in this case is our business is our business within Africa. We have so much things to do and come to terms with and understand. But when it comes to any one of the African sides or African continent, in the continent, the cities, the countries, the people, whatever it is, I just keep looking for that one common ground that brings us together. And that common ground really is just Africa itself, the continent itself. Because sometimes it is a concern, it is very worrisome, like 10 years, 20 years from now, what would it look like if the Western had its wishes? What do you think will look like? And that's what they're fighting for, they're fighting for this kind of undertone, facade, covered, whatever you name it. I mean, we all know, okay, Africa has issues. We've been supported by the Western world, and I'm not necessarily discrediting that. But it also puts us in a very awkward place. It puts us at that one position where we can't stand up and say, at this time, I get to drink the water myself. I can get to pour that thing myself and stand on my own 2 feet, do what needs to be done, for the African world. Because of, I'm just going to come back to Ethiopia and I will say a couple of things and I'll end it so others have opportunity to say too. But when it comes to Ethiopia.
Can you wrap up, please?
I will. I'm finishing. The 2 things that I want to really say is today it is Ethiopia, and what's happening in Ethiopia is not just happening because TPLF is doing whatever. TPLF as a terrorist group has been emboldened and empowered by the Western, because the Western has an interest not in TPLF, but by putting TPLF and doing this thing, they're trying to have some kind of hold on Africa and in Ethiopia. And I'm just saying we can't let that happen. I think our voices need to come together. We really need to be all about that. And the second point I wanted to make and actually end is that the social media, the Western media has a vested interest, not like I said, in doing anything else. When it wants, it doesn't say anything. For example, children are being used in the war right now, or in the Eritrean, in the Tigrayan conflict, but you don't see anyone actually saying anything about it, because, well, they have been promoting, they've been saying quite a bit about TPLF, and they cannot turn right around and say something about them now, because it is against whatever it is that they were doing together. So I'm just grateful to have this opportunity to see a whole lot of you guys so passionate about Africa and Pan-African issues. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Adote and then EMK. Please, we'll have to make our interventions brief. And if you have to continue, you can write in the chat so that everyone can read and we continue the conversation. So Adote.
Okay, thank you, Chair. My name is Adote. I'm a member of the Socialist Students and Workers Network in Ghana and also ISO Ghana. Now, I have a quick question that goes to Dichi. I wish Dichi come back and explain how, explain again how we'll be able to solve this problem in the Ethiopia and South Africa from the class perspective. Why should it be a class perspective? If he can come back and substantiate it, I think it will be very clear to some of us.
Okay, thank you, EMK. And after that, I will invite the presenters to come in, 3 minutes each.
Thank you very much. I think Adote just took the wind out of my sail, because I had the same question actually. But maybe just to say something else. More and more, especially also in my line of studies, I come to appreciate more this whole thing around ethnicity and the vital role it plays in organizing labor and land. Jackson made a very interesting case about Ghana, where Nkrumah was able to use the masses to form a base against this. But invariably, what you still even see is that even with the formation of a nationalist state, there are still invariably massive forms of exploitation going on, in terms of, because the ruling class has essentially not changed, because it's just still the same native or local elites of during the colonial era that's essentially organize or colonize the apex today in governance. So if this enemy is really at home, how do we really self-organize and bring some sort of liberation to the people? Because more and more what you see is there's a lot of exploitation at the grassroots. If you work more closely with people, you tend to see that we have a lot of interesting figures at the macro level that things are going well, but really people are living and bequeathing poverty. So how do we really confront this crisis? Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll invite Lebo, Ibis, and Jeshi in that order. 3 minutes each.
Okay, thank you. Quickly. So like, even if in South Africa, like even if you remove Zuma from the equation, sooner or later, the uprising from the masses would have erupted. Because like ESCOM is also like in crisis, we're expecting something from ESCOM. And also like the social inequality that I've mentioned in my discussion. So the Achilles heel in what has been happening in South Africa like for the past 5 years, as I was saying, was like the Achilles heel in this whole political earthquake. There's been like the absence of the organized workers to be involved in all of this action. So we haven't seen a strong movement of organized workers being involved, fighting side by side with all communities, people that have been this sporadic violence, like sporadic violence we've been seeing. So a comprehension, a short comprehension, when you look at the 1980s, the involvement of workers in overthrowing apartheid, how workers were the focal point of overthrowing apartheid. And also like some similarities you can do, like it's between South Africa and Palestine. When you look at Palestine, like and Israel, is it like the Israel state doesn't solely rely on the Palestine worker, the working class. But like when you look at apartheid South Africa, it relied heavily on the black workers of South Africa, which was exploiting. So like they were the agent of change to overthrow apartheid South Africa. But like with Palestine, it's a different case at all because like the Israeli state doesn't rely heavily on Palestine workers. But like with that say, like in rounding up, so like with this pressure that we've been seeing, this political struggles that have been we're seeing from communities, unorganized strikes, spontaneous disruptions, spontaneous struggles, like they have a powerful impact in the economic struggle. So like in the nutshell, like they fertilize the ground for economic struggle. So like workers gain confidence from that. Because like when you look at what has been happening in South Africa, like the organized workers struggle has been confined within the court system. So like the workers themselves, like we haven't seen like since 2014 from the NUMSA movement, we haven't seen workers coming out of factory workers, fighting alongside working class communities. We haven't seen that like in a very long time. So like, but that we say like this spontaneous like struggle that we've been seeing, spontaneous struggle we've been seeing, is that like they also give confidence to workers to fight back against the system, to fight back against like the state, like, and also like because like when you look at it, like workers slowly by slowly gain confidence. They believe that they can fight more to gain. When you look at like the 2015 FISMA sport, it has inspired like some section of the workers to fight. The insourcing of workers is like the inspiration that they have from the student, like we can fight more and like we can also like achieve certain demands from the state. And with that said, like workers like from community struggle, they can gain confidence. Thank you, comrade.
Thank you, Lebo. Hibist.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think there was a question in the chat concerning an ethnic state and Herman Cohen's quote about that. And I think it's necessary to think about that in relation to the interventions that have been made concerning understanding the ways in which there's accumulation takes place and the ways in which ethnicity is then kind of evoked or mobilized for that purpose, the ways in which labor is organized, and trying to understand that. I think it's one thing to use it as an analytical tool to just try and understand the ways in which that production is organized and the ways in which surplus is extracted in different ways. But the extent to which that informs, it does inform the kind of work that one can do to be, and it's actually absolutely crucial to be able to understand diverse economies, in particular in spaces where you don't have, if you really want to understand the informal economy, for instance, and things like that, especially in the South African context, is also relevant. So in that sense, it's essential. But then when we begin to attach those things to governance institutions, ways in which that also try to determine power relations, ways in which that also determines entitlements of citizens, and actually who is a citizen, who is entitled and who is not. And that's when we begin to enter a terrain that's actually very dangerous, because from an analytical perspective, one is considering that they're fluid and they're not fixed and so on, which is all right, but it's completely different when it begins to try to identify a pure target, if you will, that doesn't necessarily fit those categories. You know, when you begin to identify people on their ID cards and so on, to say you belong from this ethnicity and so on, you don't recognize the fluid ways in which people speak multiple languages, and that they don't necessarily identify with one group or the other, or there's mixed heritage. You know, all of these things become very messy for in cases when you're trying to also create to be able to understand the ways in which you can create certain dominance of particular minority groups and so on. It becomes kind of a problem for that process. So I think that it's necessary to consider that, in as much as it's useful for those purposes and useful to be able to understand the ways in which you have diverse economic activities that take place and so on, and to be able to inform the kind of strategies one can have for organizing, for instance. So what does it mean for associations that seek to organize smallholder farmers, knowing fully well you have migrant workers who are possibly slipping between someone who owns a piece of land to someone who does part-time work, someone who is basically unemployed or underpaid, doing unpaid work within the home, and also offering wage work in the other. There are multiple identities one can think of across class, ethnicity, but it becomes very difficult when one tries to use it in terms of governance. And I think at that level, that's where in the Ethiopia case, we see how absolutely dangerous it becomes. And then depending on the hands within which this kind of the narratives, then the interests that it works towards. Because and it's absolutely important to be able to grapple with these complexities, because in the Ethiopia case, what we have is a TPLF who's very sophisticated, also ideologically speaking, and they're able to play around with this precisely because they're able to fudge through these difficult questions. While it's well-intentioned, I think that we also need to be careful about how we use this and think through it collectively. But also there needs to be, I appreciate very much the point that was being made also about thinking about a Pan-Africanism that's not necessarily frozen at the national level, but also thinking beyond that. But I think that that's also a conversation that we're trying to begin now, and thinking through the dynamics between these two cases, which I think has been very generative. What is missing though in a conversation is that we've not seriously dealt with race, and to be able to understand the distinction between that and ethnicity per se, because we can't think about a Black state and the nature of the Black state and debate that and what that has meant politically, and that brings in a whole set of different conversations, and I think that will be useful for us. And the reason why, by the way, coming back again to the point I was making earlier, the reason why I picked up on it was because I was thinking of the Maikadra massacre and the ways in which you had essentially a group mobilized by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front youths went around murdering people in a town called Maikadra, which is basically within Western Tigray. And you had them basically killing migrant farm workers, who were mostly Amhara speaking, Amhara people, and they basically slaughtered them and targeted them. And then you have a minority Tigrayan group, some of them who tried to protect people, others who fled, others who were sympathetic to what they were doing. And then but you had a mixed town, and that's another thing. Like you have like towns where people come and converge with mixed languages and associations. So in as much as we want to identify particular ways that certain ethnicities might be concentrated in particular roles and positions and so on, we must also remember that the fluidity of the nature of the thing itself, that someone might migrate and start speaking a particular language, the fact that they're engaged in a particular form of economic activity. What does it mean when we want to label them as one or the other? Like what kinds of categories actually help us go beyond this? Because I think we can't, in as much as we have to take them seriously and understand how they're operating, there's also a need to go above and beyond that and to begin to identify with some other, which I think comes in the process of organization and organizing.
Yeah.
So I do, yeah, so that's fine. I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So I will take these two Okay, pardon me. Batinhun, there's Zanzo, and there's someone
Yeah.
called Mamu.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm calling from Toronto, Canada, and I have a different point of view. Um, the fight, Pan-Africanism, should have to be waged in different ways. Okay. Am I clear? Hello? Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. See,
And make it brief, please.
Okay, what we have to do is we have to not only fight the political discourse, but we have to also participate in the technological and economical venues. We have the resources and millions of people that are aspiring to be able to enrich the continent, the individual countries with the technology, innovation, and prosperity. If we can be able to expand the areas into technological and economic diversity, we have the resources. We are too many, and we don't want to be concentrating to the same old political battle which they are having the upper hand. Let me give you one example. It is, the guy who was born in South Africa is the one who is, dominating the technological field. That person, had he stayed, maybe the space race would have been won, or the innovative cars would have been won. So I'm meaning Elon Musk, who has migrated from South Africa. So what we have to do really is, let's all of us diversify the field and encourage the youth to come up, and 2-3 individuals in the continent can change the landscape. The world is now being dominated by a few individuals who are innovators and have the riches, the wealth that is bigger than a few African countries combined. So let's not always dwell on the same rhetoric of politics, ethnics, and so on, which they want us to spend most of our time and not deal with what is really the bread and butter of what the continent, what the people want. We want, if we engage our people in economic and technological innovation at the same time, and many of us in this forum included, who are labeling ourselves into the technology field, are also spending too much time in politics. So let's really be the guiding light in encouraging the people to be very productive, very ambitious, try big, bold moves to see a prosperous Africa. For example, they entrenched us into Africa 2063, which is really, really a very low goals. By that time, we should be able to have every African living in a very high standard of living, but that was not to be. The goal is not even at that as high as that. So let's really revive the goals, and let us all work towards an ambitious goal. If you really want, I can give you some research on this. You can go to 4epr.org and get some ideas on this. I have done some work on this. So
okay.
let's
can you wrap up, please?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm done. Let's really expand the agenda to go to a broader force. That is how we can be strong. If we are still concentrating on the same thing, we will not go far. Thank you.
Thank you. Mamo, you make it brief, and then Jechi will come in. And people are asking about the recording, and we want to connect with you. Please put in your contact,
Yes.
your email contact in the chat, please, so that we can share those things with you. And our subsequent seminar, webinars will also be shared with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that you opened this discussion. It's very, very nice. And that the speakers also, Dr. Hibis and all our Ghanaian brothers, all of you, you made nice speech. Now, I just want to say to you, the challenges to make unite Africa. We must do a few things. One is the biggest crisis we have is leadership crisis, leadership poverty, leadership curse. We need to change leadership in Africa. The leaders, when they run for government, they must not go for power, for self-advantage, for money, for pocket. They must be to serve the people, not to be served. If they are not, even the population, when they vote, if they don't vote for them, knowing that they are going to do this, if they are running, unless they do dictatorship, military coup, then I think we should really, genuinely, I'm asking you to do that. We also need to sanitize governance. The governance system we have in many African countries is very autocratic and dictatorial. That has to also change. Genuinely has to change. The institutions also have to be very, very well functioning. We need to do that. And the system has to be inter-African unity. We are now creating, I just did, it's called ASSIST, Association of South-South Cooperation for Innovation, on Innovation System and Transformation. And we're now running a series of panels. I just put it on the chat. I hope you will all participate in it. We are having, I had a supervisor when I was a student. Now I'm here in South Africa. I'm a research teacher professor here. He was fascinating. When we wrote a book called Putting Africa First, a very nice book. I think I should show you that book. Very important book.
Can you
Yes.
put the name of the book in the chat and wrap up so that we can continue?
Yes. But I think it would be nice if you are able to see it. Can you see it? I can show you the book. If you can. Yeah. But the most important thing is putting Africa first. This supervisor of mine said the Africa they put last must be put first. So he was very, very, what I'm suggesting to you is that we are not yet doing that work, and we should really be systematic in terms of how we really revalue Africa and all the colonial mentality we have, the SIM card, the hard disk, the software, all this in our mind has to change. The Mwalimu Nyerere said Tanzania is a colonial mistake. Kwame Nkrumah said either we unite or we'll perish. Still, these great visions still are Africa is not uniting; it's still perishing. The states we run, all of them are copied. They are not indigenized. They don't value the indigenous knowledge. They don't value the knowledge heritage, the spiritual heritage, and our struggle heritage. They're not combined very systematically. We don't put it in the education system. We don't. There's so many problems we have. Unless we change this, look what's now happening. Children being war. I know this happened in Laos and Cambodia first, and then Charles Taylor in Sierra Leone and Liberia. Remember the war that happened, and now we are having it. Unbelievably, we are having it now in Ethiopia. How could our children? They should be going to school, not to be military and be attacked like this and be used and misused. So because of all these challenges we have, I prefer that we do this systematically. I'm sorry about this. I'm a professor, so I talk a lot. So
yes, you can continue in the chat and then put the title of your book in the chat. Put we are going to close, but then not now. You can still write, and then we will read. Thank you. So Jeji, please come in.
All right, thanks for all the very interesting and exciting comments as well. Again, in the space of a discussion, you have to select what you can address and what you can't, because we all know the constraint of time. I want to address myself to two things. Adote raised the question, why class? But also our brother from who called from Canada, Bantayehun, and forgive me if I mispronounce your name, also made a reasonable sounding and passionate plea that we should expand our horizons beyond politics, and that there are other areas of cooperation and solidarity that we ought to give equal, if not greater, privilege to. So those are the two things that I want to see if I can address. First of all, in relation to class, well, part of what we're describing here is ethnicity and nationalism. And therefore, when we talk about class, we have to see it in some degree in relation to those two categories or modes of existence or identities and so on. The important thing about nations and nationalism and nation states is that they are extremely modern things, okay? These are things which are very much arose only in the context of the last 500 years, only in the context of capitalism. And for a very simple reason. From one point of view, you can understand it as a process by which the rising middle class, the bourgeoisie, which had escaped the control of feudal lords on the land, had gone into trading and other kinds of financial activity, industry, and so on and so forth, were investing in shipping and the navigation of the world and global trade and so on, were reliant on technology and so on, were becoming money lenders to the feudal lords themselves who were fighting wars and so on. We're very much interested in leveraging their economic power into their political power, because even though they were growing in strength in terms of economic power, the rule of the aristocracy, the rule of the feudal lords always put a constraint on them. The feudal lords itself and the feudal regime itself, since it's based on rival land owning, is very fragmented. Each small area will have its customs barrier before you can trade with others. Population cannot move, technology cannot move, capital cannot move, and so on. So the idea of a nation state in this very simplistic snapshot was that you remove all those internal barriers, you create one national market under the control of this rising class with this new way of organizing economies, which is not based on your ancestral loyalty to this feudal lord and this ethnic group, but because you can work or not work, or what you own or what you don't own. Whatever you own, you bring to the market as an equal citizen. If all you have nothing on earth, and all you have is your capacity to work, bring it, I'll enter a fair deal with you. The employer needs you, you too, you need employment. It's a fair bargain, it's equal rights, and so on and so forth. That is the ideal of capitalism. So the nation state clearing all those internal barriers, creating a common market, preferably a common identity, a common language. That is why from the 12th, 13th, 14th century, when these new merchants began to gather in cities and so on, began to govern themselves, gradually grew, you also find that the languages, the multiplicity of languages in their country, the multiplicity of religions increasingly became one. One language and one script was imposed. Some of our, in our time, some of our nationalist leaders have tried to do so. So the script of Hindi that people like Nehru and Gandhi imposed on India as the national script, or the Mandarin form of Chinese that Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party after 1948, so people have tried to do that. The difficulty with late developing countries is that by the time you are coming into existence, some of these states have become global entities. Their companies have become global entities. Royal Africa Company, East India Company, so on and so forth. So your room to create your own nation state is non-existent. Not only that, they are actually dominating you, first in the form of slavery, secondly in the form of formal colonialism and so on. And it is in the fact that those competing to carve up the world as imperialists themselves were national entities. That is why the model of control they exerted over the world was also to create new nation states. What we have is the colonial legacy of that modern national state creation that we talk about. Whichever way you look at it. So the point I'm making essentially is this, that the idea of nationalism is not one that inherently is necessarily a progressive thing from the point of view of working people as a whole. That is why as far back as 1848, Marx and Engels, writing the Communist Manifesto, could say the working people of the world have no country, and have no country. All they have is to lose their chains and fight and inherit the earth, basically. Basically, I haven't rendered the quote very well. I don't even remember it, but essentially, you have no nationality. What you have is a class. We too are socialists. Our starting point is that at every level of nation state, a number of things happen. The first things that happen is that those at the helm of that nation state have every interest in maximizing the amount of surplus that can be generated within their nation state. So the exploitation of workers and so on and so forth, the concentration of land, the building of industries, creation of infrastructure to facilitate the process, and so on. Sometimes they are able, those who have a head start, because they've been investing for a long time, because they've been developing techniques to give them a competitive edge, are able to outcompete each other on the basis of how much capital they've amassed previously, whether in the form of just liquidity and money, or how much capital they've amassed in terms of sheer productive power and technology. So today, for example, you say mobile money. It is because huge telecommunications companies and the fact of globalization of finance are able to penetrate every nook and cranny, every darkest corner and hamlet, be it in Ethiopia or wherever else, to extract their 1 birr or their 1 kwacha or whatever it is from some minute transaction that somebody can conduct. It is far cheaper than a national government after independence trying to establish a post office in every village, a rural bank here, and so on and so forth. It is far cheaper once banking was taken over in Africa by the multinationals after the structural adjustment. This was, and the whole switch of rural banking was left aside. Now this new frontier has opened up and so on. Whichever way you look at it, monopolies are exerting a real force in terms of organizing economies, extracting values. For states that are small, because let's face it, our states may be bigger than most companies that exist in our country. But they may still not be bigger than what East India and Company and Royal African Company was 300 years ago. So in a certain sense, they are very tiny. And if you look at the example of the Ethiopian case, what it tells you is this, that there's only so far that you can go carrying local exploitation as the basis of aggregating surpluses, which you can invest in infrastructure, in trying to diversify your economy minimally, and so on and so forth. And even the trigger that you need, the mechanism that allows you to diversify your economy, is not the fact that workers are becoming more productive and can produce more surplus value because you have great technology. It is because you have cheap labor. So take Ethiopia again. As I said in one of the opening remarks, Ethiopia is a country which today is the leading light in terms of the fastest growing pace of development in particular sectors of light manufacturing. Textiles and garments is one example. But an Ethiopian textile worker today earns about 1/10 of textile workers, not in Bangladesh or Vietnam, which are cheap, we all know are cheap outsourcing, but of Kenya and Lesotho and even Swaziland. In other words, it is that pressing down of cheap labor, this process of what I refer to as absolute surplus value, where it is not the relative capacity to the productivity level, but your capacity to work hard, long, for less and less and less relative to what you can produce. This is the basis of the tribulation that's taking place. So Ethiopia may have wowed all kinds of people, developmental types, with the so-called developmental state and the degree to which there has been this economic miracle and turnaround that I referred to before. It may have done that, but it has done so on a shoestring. It has done so not by enriching its population. The majority of the population still cannot constitute a viable market for local domestic demand for that to be a self-sustaining process of Ethiopian capitalism itself. So there is no way forward for Ethiopia but to do two things. One, continue to exploit its people, its farmers and workers more and more, number one. Number two, since it is running out of options, try to open up, shift away from the model of this strong state control of neoliberalism and shift to a more open global model, which will allow more foreign capital, more foreign technology, rather than this deal with this Chinese here, this deal with this Dutch, be an outsourced flour producer for some Dutch company and so on and so forth. On a bigger scale, they are trying to do, and having built all this infrastructure, these industrial parks and so on and so forth, having run into debt, and given how little foreign direct investment there is in Ethiopia relative to the size of its economy, given how much public investment has gone into it, more than any other country in Africa, a section of the rulership feels that this is the time, the right moment to have the credibility to move, to invite, to be a credible participant in the flows of global capital, in opening up into new deals and so on and so forth. Except that, the problem is that it threatens the model of consensus, which allowed that ethnic nationalism to combine. Now, that ethnic nationalism was not a guarantee against the exploitation of the majority of people. Neither will be this new neoliberal opening up, this liberalization, further neoliberal liberalization opening up will be, that too will rely on this. And I'm saying this is not a crisis specific to Ethiopia alone. Because again, that condition of having little capital and little productivity is a condition afflicting Africa as a whole. Not only that, but there's a premium on the ways in which, the traditional ways in which exploitation has taken place in Africa, from which other sources like finance are trying to diversify. One of which is the natural resource question, the land question, and so on. And as I pointed to it out, once you had that commodity boom taking place from around 2002 up until 2014, having a blip in 2014, 2013 coincides with the first fiscal crisis of the Ethiopian state that Hibis was talking about. Sometimes we must correlate some of these things. I mean, it's not a mechanical, robotic, automatic thing, but there are clear signs that there's a general interrelationship between some of these trends and tendencies. You have a situation where from that point on, and then the rise again in 2016, now attempts to find oil here, do this there, blah, 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 so on and so forth, and attempts to use new models of public infrastructure, the whole stream of revenue, arising from infrastructure to become the basis in which, you can invite financial speculators and financial investors to have a long share, buy shares, securitize, all kinds of deals taking place. All of that is only possible if those who are investing in your country or buying your public debt are sure that you are generating enough surpluses in your economy to pay back those bonds. Whether they call it green bonds, whether they call it social bonds, whether it is the same mechanism at work. So if the growth, the commodity boom has put a new premium on natural resources, plus global food crisis, which happened 2008, again in 2011, is beginning to happen again, plus climate change and so on, plus energy conflicts and so on. What it means is that even a common family head, even a common clan head, even a common ethnic head has every interest in privatizing the land. They may not call it privatization. They may go and hide under the World Bank program and say, we want land administration, land title to rationalize the process. The king of Bafokeng in South Africa can go into a production share model with global capital on the basis of the platinum mines. Why do you think when the Zulu king dies today, there is as much conflict? It's not because of 6 wives and 2 Rolls Royces. No. Just like the king of Ashanti in Ghana and so on and so forth, people who, when I was growing up, they couldn't even call themselves king. Now they're all being refurbished, enhanced, because that tradition and custom, this new tradition and custom that is being reenacted, is the basis for legitimizing the concessions, the dispossession, the fragmentation that is taking place, the constant undermining that is taking place of people's ability to hold on to the small productive assets that they have without appearing to be dispossessing them frontally, the way in which, let's say, enclosures might have taken place in Europe or under the brutal guise of apartheid in the early pre-apartheid settler colonialism that was enacted in South Africa. I am pointing to the fact then that it is not possible to continue to generate increasing growth on the basis of community or national resources. It is not possible to do so by cheapening labor, by raising the cost of everything else for existing, by exploiting people, by driving people to a position where no matter what diversity and diversification of combined livelihood strategies that they have, that Hibis referred to, the inexorable element is that increasingly people have to sell some part of their labor for a wage. There is a commonality of experience emerging in hybrid forms, in all kinds of forms. It is emerging nonetheless. It is the most distinct and entrenched pattern in every single country in Africa. There is no doubt. There is no doubt. Anyone who wants to really understand African economies, this is this process of intensifying exploitation and this land question and the diversification of different new economic sectors based on that. This is the model that we have today. From that point of view, nation states can be the ones assuring global capital of this new access and these new opportunities. Nation states can be the ones arising between the conflict that the productive forces, this conflict over land and natural resources, plus the production relations driving people off the land at the same time, trying to strengthen their ethnic identity. It is only the nation state in its various permutations that can arise in between and try to mediate that process itself. So it's not simply about the economics, it's also about the politics. In terms of the ideology, in terms of it is the only one that can reenact something like ethnic nationalism and give it some degree of legitimacy and keep driving it forward and so on. So we have to understand that whether it is you are a person who grows cut flowers for the Dutch market, or you work in the textile factory, or you work digging the dam or whatever it is, or you work in any capacity, even if you are selling on the street in Africa, what you are doing in effect is that you are part of the distribution circuit of global value chains, global production networks, and their supply chain. The market you are serving maybe is too poor for the multinationals to come and invest, building a retail shop with paid staff, give them pensions, health benefits. No. So you have to take on, exploit yourself. A smaller petty capital sets up, has about 10 people working for them. Your labor share is almost like a piece rate. You sell whatever it is, you are part of the global circuit. You are not outside of it. You are increasingly part of it. And every family in every rural area increasingly is under pressure for part of its household to perform those type of labor, even as we are looking for formal jobs in the civil service, in the public sector, in utilities, in energy, God knows what. This is the real nub of the equation. So, final. So whichever way you look at it, whatever brand of economic nationalism or permutation of brand of economic nationalism strokes neoliberal strategy that any section of our ruling class take, it depends on one thing and one thing alone: the exploitation of an increasing number of our people through market mechanisms and through rendering their capacity to exist independently by having some viable productive asset more and more and more impossible to survive on its own. That's the first thing. For that reason, 1 minute, please. For that reason, our comrade from Canada, I understand purely the sentiments that you're talking about, but I'm sorry, all due respect, I think it's a bit idealistic. I'll tell you why. Let's take a current example. Vaccines. We are in a COVID crisis, we want vaccines. Most of our countries, even though the TRIPS and public health regulations in the World Trade Organization offer them some degree of leeway to do compulsory licensing so that certain vaccines, even ARVs from HIV time, only 3 countries have enacted that in their national law. I'm not saying law decides everything, but I'm trying to say the idea that you should go and let's say support, I'm giving just a hypothetical example. You say you're a Pan-Africanist, a third worldist, a global South champion. Okay, fine, let's assume that is the way to go. Cuba is developing its vaccine. In its third phase trials, it doesn't have the money to do so. If every African government, and this is a hypothetical question, hypothetical point, every African government says we're going to donate $20 million each to Cuba to do its trials and ramp up production, all of us will have a production share 2-3 years or 18 months or 9 months down the line. Part of it will involve technology transfer. We'll have regional hubs. We'll start producing it. All of that, technically nothing stops any of that, except for this. If you are going, it's only $20 million. I mean, the same countries have spent hundreds times more supporting Bill Gates and big seed companies in terms of agrarian, what's it called, green revolution in Africa, so on and so forth. So it's not like they can't spend it. But to do so means that you are biting the aid hand that feeds you. If you are looking for investment, like the way Ethiopia is looking for investment, the way I'm talking about, the way Ghana would like to outcompete Kenya, the way Nigeria would like to outcompete Egypt for the same type of investment, you do not go upsetting the regime that exists. Because to you, the 20 million and the vaccines is a small thing compared to the capacity to revive other sectors and so on and so forth. So to do so, you will require a different set of priorities. Even though it's only 20 million. To do so, you will have to revamp the universities in a different way. You have to remove the barriers to educational and technical excellence. Remove fees, for example. Fees must fall. You have to revive all the industrial research institutes. You have to give a new priority to things that, as a result of neoliberalism, have been specifically deprioritized so that the market can take over. That's the point. So I'm sorry, you can't escape the politics of it. For us to come together in any technological, you require a different set of priorities imposed or brought about by a different balance of forces in who makes decisions, who controls resources, and so on. It's an eminently political question. So my brother from Canada, the Banteyoun, excellent point, but I would like you to twin and integrate this, your desire for excellence, with excellence in, people can say you need the discipline and the excellence to survive in the market. Let me tell you what's a lot more difficult. You need the discipline and excellence to survive in a real democracy. A democracy where the needs of the tiniest pastoralist community of women have to have the same weight as the big multinational company. And a real democracy involves how do you harmonize this from the local level right up? How do you ensure that farmers govern their space, workers govern their production, so on and so forth. So without that, those who stand to gain the most from the arrangements and technological innovation that you're talking about, those who will be freed from absolute separate labor to at least the minor improvement in relative separate labor, they have the least say. It is that transition that is blocked by the model of growth and accumulation, the model of profit seeking in Africa. It is not a question that can escape politics, I'm afraid. And that's why, apart from the fact that this is a political organization and a politically oriented research organization organizing this, and that's why we have to return to that primacy of politics. So my brother, Your excellent ideas have to be in service of a social agenda rooted in some section of your population whose needs are universal needs, whose needs require unity with other ethnic groups, whose needs require fighting against the oppression of women, whose needs require that all the minorities, religious, sexuality, and so on and so forth are given the same equality as everybody else. That means whose needs require weakening and perhaps breaking the power of the regimes that exist, the length and breadth of our country and the regime that exists in the whole world. It's an eminently political question, and I'd really like you to join us to actually look for the solutions in the way that our South African communities are trying to do at whatever level they can do that, so that we can scale up. Not simply to Ethiopia, but also where you are, to Canada itself, including all those indigenous people who are suffering the same natural resource exploitation that we are talking about here. Sorry for taking so long. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dechi. And I think we have come to the end of the discussion, and we are grateful that you are able to stay with us for 2 hours. And Dechi, do you have announcements?
Yeah, just to say, well, first of all, I'm sorry I spoke so long. Chair, you should have stopped me. Because I suspect others would have wanted to speak, and it's not fair, especially since I'm one of the co-organizers. It's a bit unfair. All the same, I hope we've left our contacts, both email and WhatsApp, in the chat. I hope people will get in touch. The essential thing here, as I was trying to say to our brother in Canada, is that you see all the talents that we have are possible to scale up according to the condition of the opportunities that exist within the society. If you have a situation where the ruling classes, whether it is because of their weakness in the global capital, or whether it's their preponderant strength at home, or whether it is a combination or interaction between the two, and their constant shift for new alliances and positions and so on and so forth, whatever it is, they will do so on the back of our broken bones if that is what needs be. They will also do so if we can be productive and technologically astute and bold as entrepreneurial as my brother is saying. But even so, you would have created a market for them, for they and their big brothers to come in, a niche for them to come and grab, as we are seeing with all kinds of local technology in terms of, and local knowledge in terms of seeds and so on being taken up by multinational companies and so on. So in the end, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that the priorities that, as our brother said, are the requirement of the majority of the population? What is it that, whatever the condition, including the conditions of today, we can begin to make gains to squeeze from our leaders to begin to, and in the process, begin to build alternative centers of power, of organization, of interconnection, and so on. And that's why I think that, comrades, please, those of you, wherever you are, please try to join those who are committed first and foremost, more than anything else, not to any country, not to any ethnic group, but first and foremost, not to any gender, not to any sexual thing, although we stand firmly with all the oppressed so that we can, for one reason and one reason alone, so that we can build that unity of all the people who actually produce the wealth in small ways, in big ways. And we can overcome the ideas that allow us to be force us to be at each other's throats. For that reason, you need to be part, as Faisal said right at the beginning, you need to be part of organizations which, however weak they are on that path, and your joining them can make them stronger. Not only will your joining them make them stronger, you too become stronger because your individual brilliant ideas or your capacities will find multiplied by being joined in this common purpose, where wherever you are, even in the difficult circumstances of Ethiopia today, you will know for sure that when things stabilize, the Tigrayan ruling class has to make up for the destruction by exploiting Tigrayan workers and farmers even more. So in Oromo, so in Amara, so at the federal government level in Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. That is inevitable. And those who know that do not wait for that. Those who know that if so many universities were built, lecturers and education workers can have power to interconnect in terms of their wages and so on and so forth. They can join that battle for revamping research, for free education, and so on. So as we saw in the Feast Must Fall in South Africa. So the long and short of what I'm saying, comrades, join the Revolutionary Socialist Organization. If you're here in Ghana or connected with Ghana in any way, please join us, the ISO Ghana. If you're in Zimbabwe, join ISO in Zimbabwe. If you're in South Africa, keep left and so on. And if there's no such organization in Ethiopia, our job, I think, is to find the one or two people who will be serious and committed about not only thinking about it, but beginning to make the first moves and the first interconnections wherever they are, be they in the diaspora, be they inside in country itself. Of course, the necessary tactics of how people are safe and so all those things go without saying. We'll pay full attention to that. Being part of a broader network such as ours across Africa, across the world, enable those tactical, nuances to be catered for better. Maybe a sharing of different resources, different experiences, and so on and so forth. The long and short, join Revolutionary Socialist Organization, because the path of nationalism, the path of ethnicity, not the way to go for a lot of us. Unfortunately, this is what we're facing in Africa today. We need a new response, and it's a response that can come best from working people in general, but from also with the critical ingredient and contribution of socialists who are committed to that unity, elevation of working people, and the power over what they produce, and the power of say in terms of the unity in their society itself. So thank you once again. Join us. Let's fight for a better world. We all deserve better. Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. Thank you, and keep in touch. Bye-bye.
Bye, comrades.
See you, comrades. Thank you very much. If you drop your email to our email or to our WhatsApp, we'll make sure you get any of the material coming out of this meeting, and also, put you in touch with the different comrades we have, the length and breadth of the continent and beyond, including in Canada, by the way. And so please, we have a lot to do. But the thing is, our friend in Canada said, where 2 or 3 are gathered, we can do something. He's perfectly right. Fortunately for him, we are more than 2 or 3. So that's an even better starting point. So let's do that. Thank you very much.